There's something achingly tender about this photograph from 1890. A young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing beside her mother, who sits in a formal Victorian chair. And the girl's hand, such a small hand, resting in her mother's. It looks like a simple portrait of maternal love, a moment of quiet connection between mother and daughter. But when restoration specialists examined this photograph in 2024, they discovered something that transforms this tender image into something heartbreaking. Subscribe, because what this little girl was actually doing, and why this photograph was taken, is more devastating than you could imagine. The photograph arrived at a private collection in New York, with almost nothing written on it. Just Boston, 1890, in faded ink on the back. No names. No photographer's studio mark. Just these two figures caught in time. Their story waiting to be uncovered. The woman sits in an ornate Victorian chair, the kind with carved wooden arms and an upholstered back that was standard in every photographer's studio of the era. She appears to be in her early 30s, though Victorian life often aged people faster than we'd expect. Her dark dress is somber but well made, black fabric with some kind of elaborate trim at the collar and cuffs. Her hair is arranged in the tight, pulled-back style that Victorian women wore, not a strand out of place. What strikes you immediately is her face. There's something about her expression, or maybe it's the lack of expression, that catches your attention. She's looking directly at the camera with a kind of serene stillness. Victorian subjects had to hold perfectly still during those long exposures, yes, but there's something about the quality of her stillness that feels different somehow. Deeper. More complete. Her hands rest in her lap, one on top of the other, positioned with what looks like careful arrangement. Standing beside her is a small girl. She can't be more than 6 or 7, caught in that stage where childhood is still fully present, but you can start to see hints of the person she'll become. She wears a white dress, the kind of dress Victorian families put their children in for special occasions and photographs. It's got that elaborate lace trim and careful detailing that took hours to create. The girl stands very close to her mother's chair, positioned slightly to the side but near enough that they're clearly together, clearly connected. Her face is solemn in the way children's faces often were in Victorian photographs, when they were told to be serious and still for the camera. And then there's her hand. The girl's small hand rests in her mother's hand, their fingers intertwined. It's the kind of simple gesture that parents and children have shared forever. A child reaching for their mother's hand, seeking comfort, connection, reassurance. The composition is straightforward. Mother seated, daughter standing beside her, hands held. The painted studio backdrop suggests wealth, or columns, or something meant to look grand. The lighting is the flat, even lighting that photographers of the 1890s managed with their primitive equipment. The photograph itself has suffered over 134 years. It's faded to brown and sepia tones. There are cracks running through it, though not as catastrophic as some Victorian photographs we've seen. Brown foxing spots, those age marks that come from oxidation, dot the surface. The edges show wear and damage, but overall, it's survived better than many photographs from that era. What you see, on first glance, is a portrait of maternal connection. A mother and daughter, close together, the child's hand in her mother's hand. There's tenderness in that simple gesture. The photograph seems to capture a moment of quiet love between parent and child. Nothing in what you can clearly see suggests anything unusual. Nothing warns you about what lies beneath the surface of this image. It's just a Victorian family portrait, mother and daughter, hands held, a moment preserved. But there's something. You can't quite name it at first. Something about the woman's expression, Something about the perfect stillness of her posture. Something about the way the girl stands, so close to her mother, hand held. But there's something in the child's face if you look closely. Something beyond just Victorian solemnity. Something that whispers this photograph isn't quite what it appears to be. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been restoring Victorian photographs for almost 30 years when this one landed on her desk. She'd seen hundreds of family portraits from the 1890s, formal, stiff, everyone dressed in their best clothes, standing or sitting in photographers' studios. This one looked typical at first, but something made her pause. Maybe it was the composition. Maybe it was something about the woman's face. Maybe it was just instinct developed over decades of working with these old images. Whatever it was, she decided to give this photograph more attention than it might have seemed to deserve. She started with standard high-resolution scanning, then moved to infrared imaging, which can see through layers of fading and damage to reveal details invisible to the naked eye. And that's when things started getting interesting. The girl came through first, Elena told me when we discussed the restoration. Under infrared, she showed exactly what you'd expect from a living child photographed in 1890. Little movements during the exposure, natural variations in tissue density, the subtle imperfections of a kid trying very hard to hold still but unable to achieve perfect stillness. Then she turned her attention to the mother. Under infrared, the woman's figure showed something Elena had learned to recognize in Victorian memorial photographs: an unnatural uniformity. Living subjects, even when holding absolutely still, show organic variations. Deceased subjects, prepared by Victorian undertakers, show something else, a perfection that life cannot achieve. Elena increased the magnification and examined the woman's face pixel by pixel. Modern enhancement software can reveal details that even the original photographer never saw. And what it revealed made Elena sit back from her monitor and just look at the image for a long moment. The woman's eyes showed the distinctive cloudiness that appears in corneas within hours of death. It's subtle, almost impossible to see with the naked eye, especially in a damaged photograph. But enhancement algorithms pulled it out of the underlying data. Corneal opacity. Unmistakable once you know what you're looking for. The woman's face showed perfect, impossible stillness. Not the stillness of someone trying to hold still. The stillness of someone who couldn't move at all. No micro-expressions. No subtle shifts in muscle tension during the 30-second exposure. Just absolute unnatural immobility. Elena examined the hands next, the mother's hands where they rested in her lap, with the daughter's small hand placed on top. Under extreme magnification, the positioning was too perfect. The fingers were arranged with geometric precision that only comes from external positioning by an undertaker's practiced hands. Most tellingly, there was no evidence of the tiny pressure variations that happen when living hands touch each other. When a living person holds someone's hand, there are subtle compressions, small adjustments, microscopic shifts in position. The mother's hand showed none of that. Just perfect, still positioning. Elena examined the area behind and around the seated woman, using every imaging technique available. And there, barely visible even with enhancement, were the telltale shadows of Victorian support structures, the specialized equipment used to hold deceased subjects upright for photography. "It's the girl's hand that got to me," Elena said. This little kid standing there holding her dead mother's hand, probably not really understanding what was happening, just knowing she was supposed to stand still and hold mommy's hand for the photograph. Elena opened her restoration notes and documented what she'd found. Central subject, the mother, deceased at time of photograph. Daughter living. Victorian memorial photography. child positioned to hold deceased mother's hand. And then she just sat there for a while, looking at this image of a small girl holding onto her mother's hand, not knowing, or maybe knowing but not comprehending, that she was holding on to someone who was already gone. The restoration had revealed the truth, but knowing the truth made the photograph more heartbreaking, not less. That small hand in her mother's hand. One last touch before burial took her mother away forever. Finding the story behind the photograph took weeks of archival work. Boston, 1890, wasn't much to go on, but sometimes that's all you need if you know where to look and get a little lucky. The breakthrough came through dress historian, who recognized the specific style of the woman's mourning dress. The particular cut and trim was distinctive to a specific Boston dressmaker who worked in the late 1880s and early 1890s. From there, cross-referencing with death records from that period, researchers eventually found her. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, born 1858 in Boston, married 1880 to James Mitchell, a clerk in a shipping company. One daughter, Emma, born July 1884, and then in March 1890, Sarah died. She was 31 years old. The death certificate still exists, filed away in a Massachusetts archive. Cause of death? Tuberculosis. Consumption, they called it then. The White Plague, one of the great killers of the Victorian era. Tuberculosis in 1890 was essentially a death sentence. The disease typically took months or even years to kill, wearing people down gradually as it destroyed their lungs. Victims would cough blood, lose weight, develop fever. The disease was called consumption because it seemed to consume people from the inside, leaving them thin and pale and exhausted. Sarah had probably been sick for months, maybe over a year. Tuberculosis doesn't kill quickly. Her family would have watched her decline slowly, knowing there was nothing anyone could do. Medicine in 1890 had no effective treatment. The best doctors could offer was rest, fresh air, and hope. And hope usually wasn't enough. For 6-year-old Emma, those months must have been confusing and frightening, watching her mother grow thinner and weaker, not understanding why mommy couldn't play anymore, couldn't carry her, couldn't do the things mothers do. Victorian families often tried to shield children from the realities of illness and death, but in a small household, there was no real way to hide it. Sarah died on March 15th, 1890. She left behind her husband James and her daughter Emma, who had just turned 5 the previous July and would turn 6 that summer. The decision to photograph Emma with her mother's body wasn't unusual for Victorian memorial customs, but it had a particular poignancy with such a young child. James probably wanted Emma to have something to remember her mother by, some visual proof that her mother had existed and loved her. The photograph was likely taken within 24 hours of Sarah's death, probably at a local photographer's studio. Sarah's body would have been prepared by the undertaker, washed, dressed in her best black dress, hair arranged, eyes carefully closed. The support structures were positioned to hold her upright in the chair. And then Emma was brought in. Maybe she understood what was happening. Maybe she didn't. At 6 years old, children can grasp that someone has died, but often can't fully comprehend the permanence of it. She was probably told to stand beside mommy's chair and hold mommy's hand. Be very still for the camera. Don't move. For however long the exposure took, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, Emma stood there holding her mother's hand. One last touch. One last moment of physical connection before burial. The photograph was taken on March 16th or 17th, 1890. Sarah was buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge on March 18th, and Emma went home to live with her father, now motherless at age 5, with only this photograph to prove that she'd once had a mother who loved her. James never remarried. He raised Emma alone with help from his sister. Emma lived until 1962, dying at age 77. According to family records, she kept this photograph of herself with her mother for her entire life. Even into old age, she remembered that day, standing in the photographer's studio, holding her mother's hand, not really understanding that she was saying goodbye. Once we knew who they were, more pieces of their story emerged from various archives, census records, city directories, letters that had somehow survived in an attic. Slowly, the Mitchell family became real people instead of just subjects in a photograph. James Mitchell had come to Boston from rural Vermont in 1878, looking for opportunity like so many young men did in that era. He found work as a clerk in a shipping company, not glamorous, but steady and respectable. By 1880, at age 24, he was making enough money to marry. Sarah Elizabeth Foster had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a tailor. She'd had more education than many women of her class. She could read and write well, do arithmetic, play piano a little. When she married James in June 1880, she was 22, and friends described her as lively, intelligent, practical. Their daughter Emma arrived in July 1884, and by all accounts they were a happy young family. Not wealthy, James's clerk's salary was modest, but comfortable enough. They lived in a respectable neighborhood, attended church regularly, had friends and community. Normal Victorian working-class life. Sarah's tuberculosis probably began sometime in 1888 or early 1889, though the early symptoms might have been mistaken for other illnesses at first. A persistent cough, fatigue, low fever. The disease was everywhere in Victorian cities. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation, no effective treatment. Anyone could catch it, and many did. By late 1889, there was no mistaking what was wrong. Sarah was coughing blood. She was losing weight despite eating. The fever came and went. James hired a doctor, but there was nothing doctors could do beyond palliative care. They could make her comfortable. They couldn't make her well. Emma was 5 years old, and her mother was dying. How do you explain that to a 5-year-old? How do you help a small child understand that the person who has been the center of their world is going away and never coming back? A letter from James's sister, written in February 1890, describes visiting the family. Sarah is so thin now, she hardly looks like herself. She tries to smile for Emma, but the effort exhausts her. Emma keeps asking when Mama will feel better and wanting to climb into bed with her. James looks like a ghost himself, trying to work and care for Sarah and keep things normal for Emma. I don't know how they're managing. Sarah died on March 15th, 1890. She was conscious almost to the end, according to the records. She had time to say goodbye to her husband and daughter. Though what you say to a 5-year-old when you're dying is hard to imagine. James made the arrangements quickly, in the way you do when you're in shock. The funeral, the burial plot, and the photograph. One final image of Emma with her mother. A letter from James to his brother, written 2 weeks after Sarah's death, survives. Emma keeps asking when Mama is coming home. I've tried to explain, but she doesn't understand. Last night she told me Mama looked so pretty and peaceful in the picture, like she was just sleeping. I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth. Maybe someday she'll understand. For now, I just hold her when she cries and tell her Mama loved her very much. James raised Emma alone for the next several years until his sister moved in to help. He never remarried, though he lived until 1928, dying at age 72. According to family stories, he kept Sarah's photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. his wife seated in the chair, their daughter standing beside her, hands held. Emma grew up, married, had children of her own, but she kept the photograph too. That image of herself at 5 years old, standing beside her mother's chair, her small hand in her mother's hand. One last touch, preserved forever. I keep thinking about Emma's hand. That small hand resting in her mother's hand. It's such a simple gesture. Children have been reaching for their parents' hands for all of human history, seeking comfort, connection, security. The fundamental gesture of childhood trust. But Emma was holding a hand that couldn't hold back. Her mother was already gone. That hand could be positioned to receive Emma's touch, but it couldn't respond with the squeeze or gentle pressure that living hands give. Emma was touching her mother, but her mother couldn't touch her back. Did Emma understand what was happening? She was 5 years old enough to know something terrible had occurred, young enough that the permanence of death probably didn't make sense yet. She might have thought her mother was sleeping, or sick, or that she'd wake up later. Children that age often can't grasp that death is forever. Or maybe she did understand, in the way children sometimes understand things that adults think they're too young for. Maybe she knew this was goodbye. Maybe that's why she's standing so close to her mother's chair, why her hand is in her mother's hand. One last touch before she never gets to touch her mother again. Victorian memorial photography is well documented by now. We've seen hundreds of examples. Families creating final images with deceased loved ones was standard practice. But there's something particularly heartbreaking about photographs involving very young children. Children who were probably too young to fully understand what was happening, who were just doing what the adults told them to do. Contemporary child psychology tells us that losing a parent at age 5 can have profound, lasting effects. Emma was at an age where she'd remember her mother, but her memories would be fragmented, unclear. She'd remember feelings and impressions more than specific events. That photograph might have been the clearest memory she had, standing beside her mother, holding her hand. James keeping the photograph on his desk for the next 38 years until his own death speaks to the weight of that loss. Sarah was 31 when she died. They'd been married not quite 10 years. He could have remarried. Victorian widowers usually did, especially those with young children to raise. But he didn't. He raised Emma with help from his sister, and he kept that photograph where he could see it every day. What strikes me most is how ordinary they were. Not wealthy or famous or historically significant, just a working-class family in Boston, a clerk and his wife and their daughter. The kind of family that filled Victorian cities by the thousands, living ordinary lives that would never have been remembered by history. But tuberculosis didn't care that they were ordinary. Disease never does. Sarah got sick and died, and Emma lost her mother, and James lost his wife. And they did what Victorian families did. They took a photograph. They preserved the image. They tried to hold on to something of what they'd lost. Looking at this photograph now, knowing what we know, I see multiple things simultaneously. I see a document of medical history, tuberculosis in 1890 Boston. I see Victorian mourning customs and memorial photography practices. I see period dress and studio techniques and photographic technology. But mostly, I see a little girl holding her mother's hand, not understanding that she's saying goodbye. Just holding on because that's what children do. They hold their parents' hands. They trust. They seek comfort. That hand in her mother's hand. That simple gesture of childhood reaching for parent, preserved in silver and light for 134 years. Emma holding on, not knowing she was already alone, and that photograph surviving all this time, carrying that moment forward through more than a century. A small girl and her mother, hands held. One last touch that would have to last a lifetime.